The Curse of Byther Creek. Byther Creek ran through the heart of Pine Hollow, a small, quiet town nestled in the Appalachian foothills. The town's history was rooted deep in the folklore of the surrounding wilderness. If you asked the older generations, they'd tell you that the town had always been at the mercy of Byther Creek. The water was the lifeblood of Pine Hollow, providing fresh fish and fertile soil. But beneath its tranquil surface, there was something darker, a presence that townspeople seldom spoke of in broad daylight. The creek, they whispered, had been cursed for as long as anyone could remember. No one knew exactly when the first strange incident occurred, but some said it was the day the water first ran red. A century ago, during a particularly harsh winter, the creek had frozen over, trapping entire schools of fish beneath the thick layer of ice. When the thaw came in early spring, the townsfolk found the dead fish washing ashore in droves. The sight was gruesome, the stench unbearable. And then, just as mysteriously as it had frozen, the creek began to bleed. A deep crimson tinge appeared in the water flowing downstream, staining the rocks and soil along its banks. Some believed it was the fish rotting beneath the surface, their blood mixing with the water. Others whispered of something far more sinister, long forgotten, evil wakened beneath the creek's bed. No one had an answer, but from that day on, Byther Creek was never the same. The stranger who came to town. Years passed, and Byther Creek became a place to avoid, especially at night. The woods grew thick and overgrown along its banks, shrouding it in a near-permanent twilight. But the legends, like the creek itself, never stopped flowing. One crisp autumn evening, a stranger arrived in Pine Hollow. His name was Elias Gray, a historian and folklore enthusiast, drawn to the town by its strange history. He had heard rumors of Byther Creek and wanted to document its mysteries. The locals were wary of him, as they were of most outsiders, but Elias was persistent. He rented a small cabin near the edge of the woods, close to where the creek ran deepest. From there, he spent his days interviewing the townspeople, gathering stories, and exploring the haunted waterway. It wasn't long before Elias noticed something odd. No matter who he spoke to, there was always a moment and uncomfortable silence that would fall over them whenever they spoke of the creek. Eyes would shift, voices would lower, and some would stop talking altogether. It was as if they feared that simply speaking about Byther Creek could summon whatever horror lived within it. The hidden journal. One evening, Elias was sitting in the town's small, dusty library when he came across an old journal hidden behind a row of forgotten books. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the name scrawled inside sent a chill down his spine. Ruth Holloway. Ruth was convinced her daughters hadn't just drowned, they had been taken. Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he continued reading. The final entries were the most disturbing. Ruth wrote of hearing her daughters at night, their voices calling to her from the water. They begged her to join them, to step into the creek and be with them forever. The last entry was just two words, "I'm coming." His heart raced as he began to read. The journal detailed Ruth's descent into madness, or so he had thought. But as he read on, he realized her words were not the ramblings of a grieving mother, but of someone who had uncovered a dark truth about the town. Ruth believed that Byther Creek was not just cursed, it was alive. According to her writings, the creek was an ancient entity, something far older than Pine Hollow itself. It had once been worshipped by the indigenous people of the land, who offered it sacrifices to keep it sated. But as time passed and those rituals were forgotten, the creek began to demand its own sacrifices. The water, Ruth wrote, held a hunger for life, a thirst for souls, and it would reach out to claim those who wandered too close into the creek. Elias could hardly breathe as he closed the journal. He now understood what had happened to Ruth Holloway. The grief hadn't driven her to madness. It had lured her into the creek, just as it had done with the Holloway sisters and countless others since. He had to know the truth. Armed with nothing but the journal and a lantern, Elias ventured out into the night. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain. The sound of the creek guided him through the woods, its murmur growing louder with each step, like a heartbeat. By the time he reached the water's edge, the moon had broken through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the creek. The water shimmered in the moonlight, deceptively peaceful. But as he stood there, staring into the dark current, Elias felt a chill run down his spine. There was something wrong, something alive in the air around him. He knelt by the water and dipped his fingers into the creek. It was cold, colder than it should have been for early autumn. His fingers tingled, and for a moment he swore he felt something brush against his skin, something soft, like the caress of a hand. Then he heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling his name. Elias. He froze. The voice was soft, almost childlike, and it echoed from the water. His breath caught in his throat as he glanced around, but the woods were empty. The voice came again, this time clearer. Elias, please. It was a girl's voice, and it was coming from beneath the surface of the creek. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized what was happening. He was hearing the Holloway sisters, just as Ruth had. His mind screamed at him to run, to turn and flee back to the safety of the town. But his feet refused to move. He could hear them now, both of the sisters pleading with him, begging him to help them. We're trapped. Elias, please, save us. Without thinking, Elias plunged his hand deeper into the water, searching for something, anything that would make sense of what he was hearing. The current swirled around his arm, pulling him in. Panic surged through him as he tried to pull back, but it was too late. The creek's grip tightened, and he felt it, something cold and slimy, wrapping around his wrist, dragging him down. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the water. The creek surged up around him, pulling him in, enveloping him in its icy embrace. The last thing he saw before the water closed over his head was the moon, cold and distant, disappearing behind the clouds. The aftermath. The next morning, the townspeople found Elias Gray's lantern lying by the creek, its flame long extinguished. There was no sign of Elias himself, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. They searched for him, of course, but as the days turned into weeks, hope faded. Elias Gray became just another name added to the growing list of those who had disappeared by Byther Creek. The town resumed its quiet existence, and the whispers about the creek continued as they always had, but something had changed. The people of Pine Hollow spoke even less about Byther Creek now, as if acknowledging its existence might invite it to claim them too. The newcomers. Years passed, and eventually the memory of Elias Gray faded from the minds of the townsfolk. New families moved into Pine Hollow, unaware of the dark history that clung to the creek like a shadow. The newcomers brought with them children, curious and adventurous, eager to explore the wilderness that surrounded their new home. One summer afternoon, a group of children wandered down to Byther Creek, their laughter echoing through the trees just as the Holloway sisters had all those years ago. They skipped stones, dipped their toes into the cool water, and dared each other to see who could stand closest to the edge. As the sun began to set, one of the younger children, a girl with bright red hair, swore she heard something, a voice, soft and distant, calling her name from the creek. Lily. She stopped and listened, her heart skipping a beat.